This is the second event in a series on the public good of statistics. The first event a few weeks ago covered statistics for the public good. Today we'll be discussing statistics as a digital public good, which is a different angle on the public good. So just to introduce that concept, there's a growing attention to the concept of digital public goods, and it was first developed by the United Nations to help countries attain the Sustainable Development Goals. So according to the UN, digital public goods are open source software, open standards, open data, open AI systems, and open content collections that adhere to privacy and other applicable laws and best practices and do no harm. So today we'll be exploring different aspects of digital public goods. So before I introduce the speakers, I'll say a bit about myself. I'm Job de Roy. I'm on the committee for the RSS Data Ethics and Governance section, and I'm also kind of here, joined here today is also Peter Wells, who co-organized the session with me. He's also on the section committee and also on the call. So we have three brilliant speakers lined up for you today, who should be on screen now. So we've got Steve McFeely, who's Chief Statistician at OECD, and he used to be Chief Statistician at the World Health Organization until the start of the year. Next up, we have Christina Rao. Christina is a research fellow and project manager of the Digital Public Good Infrastructure Map at the University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And finally, we have Nicola Hamilton. And Nicola is the head of Understanding Patient Data, which is an organization that aims to make the way patient data is used more visible, understandable, and trustworthy for patients, the public, and health professionals. So before we begin with Steve's talk, a few bits of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded. It will be added to RSS's YouTube channel. So basically, if there's anything that you're not comfortable saying in a public space, please don't say it. It's important, of course, to help the speakers enjoy themselves today. The event that happened a few weeks ago was also recorded, and we'll add links to both recordings to our monthly section newsletter. If you haven't signed up for that yet, you can do that through the section webpage on the RSS website. A few other things. Can I ask everyone who isn't a speaker today to turn off their camera and mute their mic? That way, the experience will be most enjoyable for everyone. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the talk. So we'll go through the three presentations first and then have a Q&A at the end. So please put your questions in a chat as you're going along. Peter and I will be monitoring the chat. I will give you a chance to ask for you to ask the question yourself. So if I call on you, please switch on your camera and you unmute your mic, but only if you feel comfortable doing so. If not, very happy to answer the question or ask the question on your behalf. So that covers the introductions. Over to you, Steve, for the first presentation.
Okay, thanks, Rob, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. It's my great pleasure, and thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak to the Royal Statistical Society. So I'm going to get the most stressful part of the day over and just share my slides. So can you just confirm you can see them and that they're in presentation mode? Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce the idea of, this may be a slight recap on what the first talk was, but I'll focus initially on data as a public good, data for the public good, and then I will eventually get to the digital aspect. So official statistics are a public good for all. There's a quote there from some French colleagues. And today that doesn't seem an especially odd sentence, but in fact this wasn't always the case. The purpose of official statistics has changed over many years. Originally they were the exclusive preserve of the state, and they were collected to help rulers levy armies and tax populations. And while that's still true today, statistics enjoy a much broader mandate, and now we expect them to serve society and the state. And in fact, now today, official statistics are very much recognized as a pillar of democracy and accountability. But this progressive view is pretty recent. As recently as the 1980s, in fact, in the UK, the Rayner report, which was commissioned by the Thatcher administration, had viewed government statistics very much as serving government needs, and that was its primary and almost sole purpose. And in fact, in the US, both during the Reagan and Bush administrations, they very much viewed official statistics as economic resources rather than public goods. And in fact, in the last Trump administration, we saw attempts to privatize the meteorological services and their data. So again, it shows that while there's been a progression, this is still quite a recent development. But is that the same of data? It's not clear necessarily that all data should be public goods or could be public goods. And in fact, here we see this statement from the African Data Revolution report: the data belongs to the citizens, not to the government, which is an interesting statement because, in fact, government have relatively few data on populations nowadays compared to private sector. So moving on, what is a public good? Well, I want to touch very quickly on two definitions. The economic definition really says a good must be non-rivalrous and non-excludable. But from a data perspective, I would argue that this definition is insufficient. Why? And that's because it's silent on data quality. Data may well be non-rivalrous and non-excludable, but it may simultaneously be rubbish. In which case, if we disseminate that good, it's not going to be a public good, it's going to be a public bad. And as an aside, the non-excludability element is at the heart of the open data movement. And I'll say a bit more about that because this is now important in the digital sphere where we see open data is now in retreat. So perhaps a better definition of a public good, at least from the context of data, is the more general definition, which is closer in spirit to, I think, what we want to talk about when we talk about official statistics. And that's the idea that a public good is actually for public benefit. So I think in the case of official statistics, that's pretty clear-cut. But again, what about data? Can all data be a public good? And I would think the answer is almost certainly no. But should all data be for the public good and for the public benefit? And again, I don't think that the answer is yes. I think certainly not all data can be for the public good. So the question is, where's the threshold? Which data should be public goods? Which ones shouldn't be? And how do we decide? How do we make the distinction between the two? Just as a side note too, I should add that a lot of data that could be public goods can very easily be made not public. And this applies to official statistics too. Very simply, poor licensing, just as an example, can make a public good rivalrous or excluded. So it's very easily, we can very easily turn a public good into a private good. Okay, so a very important development in the statistical world was the adoption of the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. These were adopted formally by the UN 30 years ago, in fact, this year. And in Principle 1, they essentially set out, you can see Principle 1 there, they essentially set out the notion that official statistics are a public good, in that they both meet the economic and the broad definition of public goods. So thus, when the United Nations General Assembly endorsed these principles, they were explicitly saying that official statistics are a public good. But again, one can challenge this today. I mean, some of the statistics that we're producing are so complex that more and more expertise is required. A higher level of statistical literacy is required to actually access and use those data properly. And to some extent, perhaps we're putting a barrier in the way, which is kind of distorting the information society that we purport to be supporting. Now, we could also argue that official statistics are a merit good. So a merit good usually is something like a police force or a fire department. So hence the rather dramatic picture. And this is the idea that the item, the commodity, is so important to the service that it should be funded by the public. And Rademacher, who was the former chief statistician of the European statistical system, has argued consistently that official statistics should be a merit good. Okay, and finally, just before we move on to the kind of the more digital aspect, there's been some very interesting work done by the UN and some others on really trying to tease out the difference between a public good and and serving the public good or for public benefit. And in a lot of cases now, they're arguing that official statistics and what they call community data should actually be considered as a club good. Um, and this raises some very interesting questions, particularly in the internet age. Is it only digital official statistics or digital data that can be public goods? So are analog data automatically excluded? For the public good, or to serve the public good at least, I'm not sure that's the case. But to be a public good, that may well be the case because accessing analog data is now becoming increasingly difficult. Okay, now just to also mention as a sidebar, the idea of information as a public good and serving the public good is actually embedded within the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So just to note that Target 1218 argues that people everywhere should have the relevant information that they need. Target 16.10 ensures public access to information to protect fundamental freedoms. So again, here we see very much the idea that the need for access to information, both to support democracy, but to make good decisions. But also Target 1.4 talks about the need, the access to basic services and the appropriate technologies. And I think in today's data-driven era, this essentially or implicitly includes data. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, why it matters, this is summed up, I think, probably best by a character called Cosmo in a movie called Sneakers a number of years ago, where he explains that the world isn't run by weapons anymore, by energy or by money. It's run by ones and zeros, little bits of data. It's all electrons. And there's a war out there for who controls the information, who controls our information. So why is that important? Well, official statistics play a central role in protecting the deliberative public space. That's why they are a bedrock to democracy. And this is why they should be protected both as a public good and for the public good. But official statistics are increasingly derived from a wide variety of data sources. And in fact, many now, increasingly, they're reliant on digital information that comes from social media, from credit card information, from utilities. And this is why access to some digital information is of existential importance to our national statistical systems. Also, data of all sorts of types, but digital information, they're feeding algorithms, they're feeding artificial intelligence, which in turn are making decisions and impacting our lives. So this is why we see the discussion around digital public goods becoming really, really important. And I think above all else, we need to understand that now data as a commodity, as an asset, are now a public policy issue. So they're no longer just feeding policy, they actually are a policy issue. Now at the UN, we can see the importance of this. Just recently, the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact have been agreed by member states. And embedded in this is the issue around data. And we can see now 3 different parts of the UN are now deliberating on how to manage, how to govern digital data and digital public goods. So this is the Science and Technology, or the Commission for Science and Technology for Development. So this is really looking at how information feeds science and technology, but for developmental purposes. So really trying to balance global north and global south. We have the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, which is hosted by ITU, and they're really looking at from a technological perspective. And then we have the United Nations Statistics Commission, who will now start looking at data governance from both a statistical point of view, but also a data perspective. And they'll be looking at both analog and digital. So while the focus today is digital, it's very important from the broader perspective not to ignore analog data. For many, many countries around the world, their information is still not digitized. For good reason. In a lot of cases, just basic electricity supply prevents them from doing so. And that's very important from a statistical point of view. As we start using these global data sources, we need to understand who's included in those data sets because they may not be representative. And if we're developing algorithms and if we're developing statistics that purport to measure the world, we need to be careful that everybody is properly represented. So some reflections to wrap up. Official statistics, I think, are a public good and for the public good. And I think they're also a merit good. I think that case is clear. But it's not clear that all data are public goods or should be for the public good. But perhaps a question is, should some be designated as public goods? And if yes, what would be the criteria? Who would decide which data are required to be perhaps open, to be available to serve the public good? And in fact, who even decides what the public good is in that case? Another interesting development is the transition from evidence-informed to data-driven. There's been a notable change in rhetoric over the last kind of 10 or 15 years. So we used to talk about statistics as there to support or to inform evidence. And now increasingly we see institutions talking about data-driven decisions. That's a very important transition. It may look innocent, but in fact, when we mine down into it, it's very important because evidence-informed suggested that statistics were part of a broader equation that helped to make decisions. So we provided information to policymakers. They used those information in concert with other information to inform their decisions. Data-driven, on the other hand, really implies that the data are making the decision. So this is much more the algorithmic approach to decision-making. And why that's important is we saw, for example, during the pandemic, a lot of politicians stepping back and saying, well, the decisions around public policy, around public health, we were told what to do by the experts. So effectively, they were divorcing themselves from responsibility and saying, well, look, we had no choice. The same could very easily happen with data-driven decisions where the political system may step back and say, look, this is, you want data-driven decisions. You want scientific decision-making. Okay, this is what the data have told us to do. We don't have any choice. So ironically, as we get more data or even official statistics may actually undermine democracy if we don't pay attention to the rhetoric that's been used and what it means. Another interesting debate, again attached to the digital debate, is we see now that open data is in retreat. Now, open data was always asymmetric in that it was really targeting public data, and private data really got off the hook. But now we see in the academic literature this expression about data winter and people asking, is there a data winter emerging? And that's because now a lot of proprietary data is now understood to be an asset. And because it's understood to be an asset, it's now pulling back behind a paywall and may not be accessible to anybody unless they can afford to use it. That has profound implications for the development of data-driven algorithms and data-driven AI, because the data available to train those models may actually be reducing counterintuitively, not increasing. This may lead to AI generating synthetic data to train itself, where we end up then eating our own tail, where the AI is basically training itself on its own data. And I think the last point I will leave you with, which hopefully will set up the other speakers, is really from a digital perspective, data are the genetic material of the digital world. They are the fundamental building block of almost everything else within the digital sphere. That perhaps isn't always understood, but it's really, really important. And this is why the idea of public good, the idea of data governance more broadly is critically important, not just to institutions like the UN. It's absolutely critical to everybody. So just to finish, to leave you with a thought experiment, if you don't believe me, imagine if you woke up tomorrow and all of your digital records had been wiped. So you didn't exist on any banking system, on any ID system, on any social media system. You would actually have quite a challenge on your hands trying to prove that you existed. So our digital selves are now critically important, and they run hand in hand with our physical selves. And this is why digital data and digital public goods are so critically important to our futures. And with that, I'll stop, Rob.
Thanks very much, Steve, for that thought-provoking talk. Lots of important questions you raised there. Hopefully, it'll stimulate some questions from the audience. So, just a reminder: if you do have any questions, please put them in a chat. We'll be monitoring them throughout, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the 3 presentations. So next up is Christina Rao. She's going to be talking about digital public infrastructure. So over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Steve, for a brilliant opening. I think you've set me up for success, and you've had me get rid of some of my slides. So that's a good thing. I can be short and succinct. Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be here. This is the first time I get to engage with the Royal Statistics Society. And it's a pleasure because, as you learn, this is my first foray on working with data. But I work with the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, which is very invested in not only data-based and data-informed decision-making for governance, but what is the political economy around data? Who manages it? Who owns it? Who creates it? And in an increasingly digital world, how are governance structures around data being made sense of in order to deliver public good? So I'm a social science researcher, so I like situating myself socially and politically. I am from India, I'm based in Germany, and I work with UCL. So hopefully that establishes the politics of where I come from and where I'm going. My background is in digital development. I'm a digital development practitioner, invested very heavily in not only how governments in the West, how we can learn from them, but increasingly working on state capacities of governments in the quote-unquote global South, and how we can build the capacity of such governments to be able to work with digital tools and data in a better way so that they can do this at scale. Some key research questions that I've always juggled with is how can data and technology be used for public good? So this event is aptly typed for my research interests. More than anything else, I'm very interested in what role does the state play in making sure that public interest and public good is not only being leveraged, but is also being maximized through the governance around data and other technical artifacts. A key point that you'll hear through my presentation is I manage something called the Digital Public Infrastructure Map, or the DPI map, which is a concept related to digital public goods. And hopefully I get to spend the next few minutes explaining how we can zoom out of digital public good to have a view on digital public infrastructure. So let's start a little bit from the beginning. Something that Steve alluded to but didn't specifically discuss is open data. A lot of our view on looking at data as a public good artifact has come from the open data movements, right? We've seen how the scientific community specifically has led the movement for how opening up data, making it more transparent, can allow greater research insights, more target research insights. And that sort of finding has moved into how governments do their job. It's become a tool to inform how governments basically imbibe democratic values around transparency, accountability in their governance systems by opening up the data that they use to make certain decisions, either at the federal level or at the state level with respect to a specific sector or more governance at large. But where is this data going? Who's making sense of it? And what are the challenges? So looking at it more historically, we did find some challenges. So what the open data movement did do is it opened a lot of data for research, for governance. It also catapulted the freedom of information movements, which led to citizen groups being able to hold the government accountable for providing information in a timely manner on certain governance decisions. Who gets a vaccine? When did they get it? Who is eligible for what kind of dole out? This has been splendid. It wouldn't have been possible in the absence of data. But as Steve pointed out, there's a tricky balance to make sure something is data informed versus when it becomes data driven, because there may be insights that may not be available in quantitative data, or it may make us blind to other supportive information that we need to pay attention to. So the open data movement had its own challenges. It didn't open up all data that was important for decision making or targeted interventions for states and for governments. Interoperability was still an issue. So data would be contributed on this sort of open data portal. But especially in the global south, we saw a lot of state capacity issues. Even if data was uploaded, they were in PDFs, they were in unreadable formats that were not particularly useful. And you couldn't combine insights from, say, the health ministry and the transport ministry and use them together to figure out where is pollution a concern because it overlaps with road safety issues or something like that. In the sense that if one ministry was submitting data, it wasn't an incentive for the other ministry to submit data, and sometimes it was also a capacity issue. So governments is now, when they think of digital tools and using data as a tool for decision making, they have to broaden their scope of vision. And we're seeing a trend in how this broadening is coming to be. And we're seeing this movement in what we call as digital government. So let me offer a lens, and this is a caveat is this is an oversimplification of what actually exists in governments, because we know that they're very complex beings, but hopefully this gives you a lens to view it. So we've come at this idea of digital public infrastructure. I want to use two examples. One is the one on the right, actually, is what I'm going to speak to first, which is Togo's Novici cash system, which we heard of governments using digital payments to transfer cash to households in need during times of crisis. This was especially leveraged during health crises, but also more recently during COVID, but also during natural disasters. It becomes a more systematic way and a more infrastructure-based way for governments to reach out to its people, leveraging the data it has on which household needs money, when, at what time, so on and so forth. India has also used the DBT scheme, which is the direct benefit transfer scheme, to transfer to households funds, especially those belonging in low-income groups. And this has been very successful. There's a lot of data comprised on how successful these programs have been, but there's also data on it going wrong. We've seen that a lot of times the households receiving data receiving the money or the dole outs have not been the ones who actually need it, or even though the transfer has been made from the government's end, it's not been received by the household that actually needed it. In some countries, in the US also, we saw up to 40% of the dole outs never reaching the households in need and them still struggling through crises. So what's going wrong and why is it happening? Hopefully that's being answered by what we call digital public infrastructure. So this view that I'm offering is, again, I work with Professor David Eves, so you'll see a lot of references to his slides here. He speaks a lot about digital government, and he's created this view on how governments look like today. So imagine a department that has its own technology application that further relies on a data registry or a database. And you can see several of these departments. There's a tax department, there's a DMV, this is social services. This is what each of those departments' application levels look like, in the sense of, in order for a tax department to give out taxes, each individual has to use a single sign-on, fill out a form. The system basically does an address search, checks out if you're eligible. For this, it relies on its independent databases. Across these departments, systems look different. They don't talk to each other. This is what we call a siloed structure, a vertical structure of developing digital government. And because of this, data can't speak to each other. Like I said, they can't leverage each other's data, their respective authentication information to figure out if someone is not eligible to pay high taxes, they also receive more welfare funds from the government, so on and so forth. This obviously creates problems for how governments can operate at scale and give dole-outs at scale. We also found a further complication. Not all of these governments, departments rely on their own capacity. Very often they rely on private sector capacities. Urban ministries in very many global south countries rely very heavily on transport companies, privately owned operators, enterprises that take on the job of collecting the data, managing the data, making sense of it, and then offering their services for a cost to the government. And in this scenario, very critical questions around governance emerge. If governments don't own public data, who does? If it's the community, how can collectively understood accountability structures be created so that public interest governance, and not only public governance, is forwarded and promoted? This is the movement that we're talking about when we speak of what should happen in terms of digital public infrastructure. So on the left, you see a more siloed, vertically operated system. And on the right is the sort of digital public infrastructure view of government, where you see a bunch of commonly held resources at the bottom, which are the databases, followed by the application level in the middle, followed by the services level right on top. And this means, it could mean a bunch of different things. In this structure, in this overseas simplified structure, it looks like a bunch of different things. But what it truly means is different units or departments in the middle leverage common building blocks at the bottom in order to create common services for individuals. So if you submit your data once to the tax department, it could mean that if the tax department and the health department finds that information useful, they are able to pull on that data. So it's not the burden of the individual and the citizen to contribute that data regularly. More than anything else, the same data is now held under common systems of governance. So data protection laws that are not department specific, but government-wide are applicable to each of them. This means that by submitting your data once, hopefully, you should be able to leverage all of these services together. Get a bank account, get a passport, find a job, get a phone, apply to university, get employer insurance. And they're each cross-checked. There is a validation mechanism, there is an authentication mechanism. But all of this is overly simplified again. It obviously doesn't mean that governments operate in this way, but hopefully digital public infrastructure means a movement in this direction. So what we mean in terms of operation is at the authentication level, which is how do you check if Christina is really Christina. Governments have created systems. India has Aadhaar, Singapore has SingPass. There's also transaction layers in the middle. Brazil has something called PIX. India has the Unified Payments Interface. And then there's the data exchange layer right at the bottom, which is DigiLocker, which is prevalent in Estonia. Also, DigiLocker in India, and Estonia is Xroad. What you see, hopefully, is also the differences. There's examples from India, there's examples from Brazil, from Estonia, elsewhere, which means that this is a universal phenomenon. It doesn't have to be reliant on one type of government or a particular kind of state capacity. It's leveraging different and is applicable to different capacities which are prevalent across governments. I'm going to skip these slides. I wanted to zoom out for a bit to speak about how this relates to digital public goods. Steve spoke a lot about the utility of data in building a larger vision for government and for using it for common good. The UN has defined for us what DPI is and what digital public goods are. But I find this explainer from the GovStack initiative, which is by the German Development Agency, very helpful, which is that digital public goods fit into this larger socio-technical piece of architecture called digital public infrastructure. And DPI is really referring to the technology stack that every government has, which means that it not only looks at data as a component of the good, but it looks at the middleware, what happens with the data at the component level, how data is treated, managed, exchanged, and then the application layer, and whether the application layer is dealt with by public entities or private entities. Why is this important now? Well, it's a money issue. Gartner did some research on how governments are spending on their information technology systems. How is it that they collect data, route it for service delivery, make services available to its individuals. And they found a huge variance in how countries in the global north or mature economies do it as compared to the global south. This statistic is helpful. About $700 billion was spent in 2022 across the world by governments for their information technology. Almost all of it, 612, was spent in mature economies, and only 81 billion was spent in the rest of the world. This includes an India, which is at 1.4 billion people. This is what it means for the price difference. In mature economies, $250 was spent on each of the individuals among about 2.5 billion people, but only $14 was spent among 5.5 billion people. And you can see the variance here. If we were to create some parity in this, the amount of funds we would need to spend on global south, individuals in the global south or outside the mature economies, would be about $1,400 billion, which we don't have, which doesn't exist. We'll have to start printing money more than we already do. And this is a calamity because the problems that we're trying to solve at the infrastructure level don't have a money solution. So we have to think of new ways to use the same funds, which is why digital public infrastructure matters. I was hesitant to include this, but I think, and hopefully I'm speaking to a group of statisticians, so you can come at me with feedback on how this is making sense. Digital public infrastructure is not a very mature concept. Governments are still coming to terms with how we should build horizontal resources and not vertical resources. And there are a lot of definitional issues. So the work that we do at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is to map what DPI across the globe looks like. And we have something called the DPI map. So if you can log on to this, use a QR code, but essentially it gives you a global state and the state of DPI and commonly understood components of DPI, which is digital identity, digital payments, and data exchanges. And these are commonly understood as components, but as the concept matures, so do the components increase over time. And what it essentially is a data set of how governments across the world, we've scanned about 210 countries. We found, based on a set of common indicators and components, we found how they differ with respect to the technology architecture, the governance structure, and how it's adopted by the public and private spheres of government. And it's based on an inductive and deductive process of figuring out which attributes, which you see on the left, are important to DPI, and accordingly how they can be measured. This is what we found. About 57 countries across the globe have digital identity systems. 93 countries have digital payment systems, and 103 have systems to exchange data. This is the minimum viable set of criteria. It could be that the systems across these 57, 93, and 103 countries don't look the same at all. But at the very minimum, they allow for a certain amount of digital authentication to happen, for some kind of digital transactions to happen, for data to be exchanged in real time. And based on these criteria, we try to sift through, can governments truly do this if they rely on their state capacity to a certain degree? This tool is meant for researchers and governments alongside builders and advocates who work in this process with government. So I hope I find some users in this room. And if you're keen on using it as a resource for research, even if you don't work with government, I hope you leave us a note to tell us if it was helpful, good data, bad data, because we're trying to solve public good questions through this. And I'm going to end with this, which is what it helps us find out. So the system of how governments can solve that issue of people who receive digital payments in their bank accounts, do they truly deserve it, depends on a rather sophisticated sophisticatedly understood concept of digital identity, which is there a way to identify is Christina, is Job, and what kind of identity marker to be used to establish in the system? And can the tax department, the health department, the transport department use it using the same infrastructure tools? This is what the state of things look like. On surveying 210 countries, we realized that about 164 claim to have some system to do that digital identification, but only 93 of them are actually operational, even though they might claim to have something like this. Of the 93, only 87 actually allow a system to digitally authenticate someone. And very few of them, only 57 of them, actually allow for such a system to be used across departments of the government, which is a very interesting finding, because you're saying that you have a digital identity system, but it's the same siloed architecture that a tax department might have that's different from a health department, so on and so forth, in which case it's not an infrastructure. And we've done these surveys across different components of what we call infrastructure. We found differences in income levels. So we found a very quick takeaway saying in middle income countries, a lot of the payment systems operated involve private actors. But with high income countries, that changes if we say we're only looking for those operated by central banks. And this is where that difference around public interest governance comes to play, because if data cannot be collected, managed, made sense of by public actors, then they rely very heavily on private actors. And if private actors do not have a public interest governance structure in place, then not a lot can be managed with respect to public good. So governments are increasingly waking up to these dependencies, and they're trying to see how they can work around these. I'm going to pause here with key takeaways. Hopefully, this offers a view on what digital public infrastructure looks like across the world. It's helpful to view data, AI, and other technology artifacts as part of the tech stack, because while data itself is a very complex technology artifact, the dependencies on who creates and manages it also depend on who occupies the higher levels of that same country's technology stack. It's important to look not only at the role of the government, but also private actors and civil society in not only creating data, AI models, other technology artifacts that are important to digital futures in countries, but also those of private and civil society actors. And then finally, hopefully, digital public infrastructure offers a more sustainable approach for governments to look through the socio-technical variables that come to play when we think of governance of these goods. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christina, for that sort of wider governance perspective, and also looking at what different countries do in terms of digital public infrastructure. It might be worth putting a link to the DPI map in a chat so people can access it in case they want to. I've had a quick look at it. It does seem like a very useful website, so thanks, Christina. Great. Great, so we'll move on to the final speaker of today, Nicola Hamilton from Understanding Patient Data. She's going to be talking about the role of citizen science.
So as mentioned before, so UPD aims to make the use of health data more visible, understandable and trustworthy. We are based in the NHS Confederation. We mainly work in the UK, but we do also work on a few international or EU projects as well. Next slide, please. So just a few thoughts first on what data as a public good means to me. So when we talk about public good, public often makes it sound like there's one public, but there often isn't. And whilst I agree that things like universal internet provision, website safety certificates, etc., are provided for the public good, it's always a bit of a double-edged sword. So internet provision can mean that more public services go online because that's decisions that the government takes, and then that might not be suitable for some groups in the population who then get left behind. What's good for one group might not always be good for another, and this comes back to the definitions of public good that Steve was talking about earlier, and whether we see it as something that's in the public benefit or not. And I kind of tend towards that side of things when I'm describing public good. And who gets to make a decision about what the public good is in any one situation? Those in power often are likely to have a different definition of what public goods is and isn't. So my background is as a civil servant, and you often think what you're doing is for public good, but sometimes it might just be the answer that makes delivering a public service easier or cheaper for your particular part of the state, but undoubtedly makes it probably more expensive elsewhere. Lots of statisticians as well see themselves as providing neutral factual information, but as we all know, data is inherently political and wields power. So even if statistics that are created are meant to be factual, they'll either be used, misused, or not used by those in power. We know that there are figures that crop up in ministers' briefing packs all the time. And we know there are others that don't because they don't support a particular narrative. So I remember personally having to deal with an issue relating to a statistic that kept being used by ministers in the COVID pandemic that didn't have an accurate definition or wasn't quite being used with its accurate definition. But it helped show that the department had met a very important milestone. But then the story became about that figure rather than the successes that the programme had achieved in a very short timescale, and that then impacted how people then scrutinised other statistics coming out of that programme. And when you kind of mix the stats with the public health world, it can get quite complicated in terms of the messaging and trust in the activity. So for me, thinking about data as a public good has a huge reliance on trustworthiness. Next slide, please. So whilst most surveys and research findings tend to show that large majorities of people trust public institutions in using their data, in my role, I tend to be more exposed to the people that don't share those levels of trust. Trust in the NHS using people's data has decreased a little bit in recent years, as has the trust in the government, the police, even the Office for National Statistics. And although it's generally high, if you look at the most recent Public Confidence in Official Statistics survey in 2023, if you take out people that use official statistics, it's 82% of people trust the ONS with their statistics. So about, 1 in 5 don't or are questionable. A key area to explore for me then is if we truly want data to be a public good in and of itself, is thinking about democratizing data design and collection processes. And this is difficult because it can both help and make things a bit more difficult. Historically, the focus has often been on going out to communities and collecting data through predetermined means. So we've already designed the questions and the types of answers that we're expecting, or we're reusing data that's already been collected for another purpose. So, through service provision by the states, and using that to answer questions. But what happens if we're not asking the right questions or collecting the right data? So one option is to think about citizen science or citizen-generated data as a way to increase participation, improve relevance, and develop trustworthiness. And this can be in conjunction with official statistics. It doesn't have to be instead of. And the UN has started to develop a framework, the Copenhagen Framework on Citizen Data. And within this, the definition of citizen data that it originates from initiatives where citizens, and there's a very broad definition of citizens, either initiate or are sufficiently engaged at the minimum in the design and/or collection stages of the data value chain, irrespective of whether these data are integrated into official statistics. The design stage includes thinking about the objectives, the policy issues, and the data that are needed, any partnerships and collaborations, methodologies and approaches to data collection, who can access that data and use the data, how the data are being used. And then the collection operations is about how this is put into practice, whether this is through civic action owned by citizens and communities, civic driven, so initiated by citizens and civil society organisations, but implemented in collaboration with others, jointly initiated or co-created to varying extents, or state or private sector run with no or very limited collaboration with citizens. And so you can see in the diagram the minimum areas of what the UN expects for something to be considered citizen data and the ideal, which is across that whole value chain. Next slide, please. So health is probably a sector where there is the most significant benefit to the population potentially, and where people feel like their data can help people like them and their communities. So it's an area where people are potentially more likely to participate in citizen data initiatives. In particular, this could help develop more trustworthy systems in which data is seen as a public good rather than something that's assumed to be incorrect or not representing specific communities. So taking underrepresented groups specifically, there are still many examples where they aren't adequately included, consulted, or conclusions become incorrect. So, for example, at the moment, my team's doing a project with the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community with the University of Worcester and key organisations in the Gypsy, Roma Traveller space. Looking at ethnicity data collection of these groups, in the 2021 census, you've got 19 ethnic categories. The main GP data set in England has 18 categories. Hospital data in England only has 16 categories. Data on Roma is absent in GP and hospital data. Data on Gypsy and Travellers is absent or minimal in GP data. Part of our project included doing surveys, and even though we trialed a new-ish kind of video audio process of capturing responses because we know everyone's fed up with forms, the response rate was still really low. People didn't want to participate in another survey, even though they had been involved in designing it, because they weren't confident that anything would be done with the results and that those in power wouldn't change anything. We will still be advocating for more ethnic categories to be available in the NHS data sets, but there is a delicate balance that these communities themselves highlight, which is that they want the data collected to improve services for them and highlight any issues and discrimination that's being experienced, whether directly or indirectly, but they also don't want that data to be misused or lead to more discrimination. Another example is the recent Race and Health Observatory's exploration of the ONS life expectancy estimates and how they're affected by missing data and methodological assumptions. The Race and Health Observatory is also part of the NHS Confederation, so we work very closely with them. There's loads of evidence that people from minoritised ethnic groups have much poorer health than white British groups and are particularly exacerbated in later life. But recent life expectancy estimates show that minoritised groups in England and Wales have exceedingly high life expectancies, especially in the older ages. For example, the stats are showing that for the 2011 to 2014 life expectancy estimates that 80 to 84-year-old Bangladeshi women would live a further 15.5 years, compared to an additional 9.9 years for a white woman of the same age. The Race and Health Observatory's analysis hypothesised that missing data is a big issue. The life expectancy calculations were based on data from the 2011 census, matched to the death registrations in 2011 to 2014. But their work shows that a large proportion of people go missing from records in the 10 years between censuses, and the proportion is higher for all minoritised groups compared to white British groups. If people are present in one census but then missing in the next and don't have a known outcome, they'll continue to be counted as alive and become statistically immortal, whereas actually they've probably just migrated out of the country. And there are also methodological biases, for example, the salmon bias, whereby migrants who are unwell often return to their country of origin at the end of their lives. And this data that's missing isn't random. And the mortality rate of people who have returned to their country of birth is higher than those who stay. Whilst the new government is considering how to make better use of health data and saying that the NHS data is a public good and should be used more, there are still some steps that could be taken to make it a more collaborative approach, as it still feels very one-sided. For example, making people's health records a more shared document. At the moment, they belong to a GP or a hospital. You can get access to prospective information, but not all of your historic information. And you can't really add information. Patient-reported outcomes could be a really helpful way of supporting individual care or planning services in the NHS, and also for research. But at the moment, it's often considered a nice to have and sits separately to the single source of truth of a record. Obviously, there are data that aren't appropriate to be generated or edited by systems. So, for example, like diagnostic test results. But if you find ways to make it more collaborative, it could improve its value as a public good. Next slide, please. So I wanted to end on a couple of examples of where citizen science is being used in other countries. I'm part of a project at the moment that's organised by the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is exploring the use of citizen science, citizen data to combat environmentally sensitive infectious diseases. It's looking at a few specific diseases such as cholera, dengue, and yellow fever across 6 different countries. It's still early days, but some of these countries already have grassroots organisations working in these spaces, and there are collaborations with the research community. One example is the community-based surveillance programme run by the Red Cross societies. This is the systematic detection and reporting of events with public health significance from within a community of community members. They've raised over 15,000 health risk alerts to authorities across their platform through 21 countries. And they make tools available to their 17 million volunteers worldwide so that they can report on health risks and unusual events that aren't often picked up by more traditional surveillance systems. Another example is Sight Savers in Nigeria, who were investigating the living conditions of and environments of women who often go unnoticed in small rural communities, but have a disease called schistosomiasis. They had a plan for how they wanted to conduct their research in focus groups, but they weren't having much success. So they spoke to these women about their experiences to understand like what was going on, and learned that, you know, I mean, it's not entirely surprising, but people don't want to talk about their intimate health in front of others in focus groups. So they changed the approach and adapted it to do kind of one-to-one in-depth conversations instead, and that provided them with much more useful evidence that they could then take back to understand the spread of that disease. I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nicola. I think highlights really nicely the opportunities for citizen data, not just in health, but seems like a lot of opportunities elsewhere too. Great. Okay. Right. So we've got about 25 minutes for questions. I can see some questions in the chat already. I will kick us off with a question, and then I'll go to the chat. So all of you touched, I think, on some kind of global perspectives or kind of global initiatives that are happening. Just wondered, which countries do you think are leading the way in creating and maintaining the digital public goods, and what can the UK learn from those countries? And also, what are the challenges for some of the countries? I think Christina, for example, touched on, I think, analog data and sort of lack of digital infrastructure, but great to hear your thoughts on that. Don't know who wants to start.
I can just say something quickly, Rob. I think every country can learn from every other country. From a data perspective, I think, well, I should start by saying we can learn from other countries, but the context is always important and the culture is always important. So when I worked in the Irish Statistics Office, we were always looking with envy at the Nordic model and trying to see, you know, how can we replicate that. But one of the challenges we faced, it wasn't technological, it wasn't technical, it wasn't statistical, it was cultural. The way we viewed government was very, very different in Ireland. And I think probably closer maybe to how the UK population views government than a Nordic population does. So that there's a lot of issues around trust. So you can have a lot of digital data that's available. You can start, technically you can link it, you can make it available. You can derive new public goods from it or knowledge products. But culturally, if the public aren't comfortable with that, then that's a challenge. So I think you can learn lessons from other countries, but it's important not just to look at the technical issues, but look at the context and the cultural background. Because oftentimes when things fail, it's because we've ignored the behaviors of the population.
Thanks, Steve. Christina, Nicola, like to add anything to that?
I would just add, I think Taiwan's done some quite interesting work around their digital infrastructure. Like they've really promoted, they've really made sure that everyone's got internet access, and then they've built a lot of their public engagement with government through digital means. So like Polis and those sorts of kind of that sort of infrastructure. But it does rely on access, and it relies on everyone being able to use those tools. But I'd say it's quite an interesting example to look at in terms of how things could work. But I don't think it's necessarily like you couldn't just pick it up and drop it in the UK and it would work. I think communities in countries in South America are tending to take more of a community-based approach to some of their data work, particularly in Brazil and Colombia, but it's not something I've dug into loads, but it's quite an interesting area.
Just supplementing what Steve mentioned about the different backgrounds and cultures and contexts of different governments matters. What we've seen, especially from an infrastructure perspective, is that not only data, but how governments approach building their digital stacks depends very highly on who is the influencer and what the starting point is. For very many of them, economic considerations are the primary reason why they would choose to build, because it leads to high economic growth at higher rates, so on and so forth. But in very many contexts, we found influencers. Sometimes these influencers can be open source communities, and the leaning towards participatory governance, decision making, so on and so forth. India is an example I commonly bring up because I'm from there. But what we saw in India is there was almost private sector influencing happening around the need for the state to build its own capacity, to build its technical artifacts. The differences matter because even though the Estonian model and the Nordic model of interoperability and open source is very sophisticated and it's a great aspiration to have, it's not the reality for a lot of countries. So there might be more realistic examples, say from Ethiopia, that's building its identity system in a very participatory way. Brazil, that built its transaction network around PIX, where the government and the central bank took the first step to build a state capacity for individuals, businesses, and the state apparatus to transact in a common network. It came from their leaning towards participatory governance, and each step of that technical architecture was built in a very participatory way. They invited civil society participation, private sector participation at each point, and that's a very good model to follow for Global South countries at least.
Thanks, all. I think it's made very clear there's no one-size-fits-all approach and need to take into account cultural context, as you all highlighted. But it sounds like some really good examples from across different countries. Great. Okay, so that's my question. I'll now move on to the questions in the chat. So, as I said in the beginning, I'm going to call on you if you'd like to ask your question yourself. Otherwise, I'm very happy to read it out. So the first question is from Ramsey. So Ramsey, if you'd like to ask your question, feel free to switch on your camera and mic.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me ask my question. So my name is Ramsey. I'm working within the French Health Agency as a statistician lead, and I've been member of the Royal Society and Statistical Society for 3 or 4 years as a chartered statistician. So my question, so I had this question many years ago. So many years I read a paper titled how much is that kidney in the window? So the author discussed like arguments for allowing the sale of kidneys and in general for organ sales. So actually I was shocked because for me it's not acceptable, but the author presented some arguments in favor of kidney sales, like reduction of waiting lists or individual freedom. And of course, there is some arguments against, like ethical consideration. So for me, I was, after this presentation, I was wondering if we can apply this supply and demand principle for DPG, and we'll see, yeah, if we can have like free market or restricted market, or just to debate, to make some discussion on this. So maybe the main question would be, who would be the main benefit for this and who might be at risk? So if we can ensure like fair distribution for data technology, maybe it could be a good solution. So yeah, it's just an open discussion on this idea. Yeah.
Thanks, Ramsey. Anyone have any thoughts? That one, Steve?
Maybe I'll start. So a kidney is a personal, like you own your kidneys, so it's not a public good. It's very much a personal good. So I would draw the analogy and say, okay, you could sell your own data, and in fact, many of us are selling our own data every day without realizing it or giving it away. I mean, every time we sign up to one of these loyalty cards for an airline, loyalty card for a supermarket, whether we understand it or not, what we're actually doing is bartering our data for some basic discounts. So it's a basic form of sales. So we're selling our data all the time. Now, there are arguments that, or I've seen arguments that some people are saying that, you know, because we put stuff on our phone every day on social media platforms, that we're generating this data and we own it and it has an economic value. So some people are actually saying that that should be monetized and we could sell that. I've no fixed views on that particularly. I mean, I could see the platforms resisting very strongly because that's really that's their magic sauce. They're getting all of this data for free. So whether that should be transacted or not, I don't have any view, but so I guess my main point is I don't think you can transact public goods. I mean, in a way, that's almost a contradiction because they're public. So I think what you can do is transact your own data, which is a subset of a public good. That would be my view.
I think I would add to that like obviously once you've given a kidney, like there's one kidney, whereas data, there's like your data can exist in multiple places at multiple times, kind of infinitely. So how do you keep track of what that relationship is? And once you've kind of given it away somewhere, they can give it away further and they can give it away further. So it's a bit of a difficult analogy, I think. And yeah, I think we just don't have very much control over where our data is necessarily going once we've given it to something. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Like for example, like for health data, for personal health data, like for real-time monitoring. So everyone can be part of this. So maybe to produce new algorithm, new tools, it can be useful for good, but behind this good reason, there is other companies, startup, maybe GAFA, to use all this data to produce new tools, new technology, new medical device to sell it later. So I think maybe we can see it mostly in the health sector, but I don't know for other sectors.
Thanks, Ramsey. Great. So we'll move on to the next question. I see someone has their hand up. Oliver, is it linked to that topic, or is it a different question?
It's a different question.
Different question. Okay, go for it, and then we'll move on to the questions in the chat after that. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. My name's Oliver Morgan from the World Health Organization, but based in Berlin, actually. And you know, it's interesting because we also work with a lot of global good data and data products. And often the kind of, when people talk about global goods, there's a kind of implicit understanding that once they're out there in the world, they're kind of free to use, and that there's no additional cost associated with maintaining those digital goods. But you know, even data has a cost of maintaining it, because let's say it's a longitudinal piece of data that you need to kind of continue to collect it for it to be useful. And I saw somebody commented on kind of the salmon bias in the chat as well. So I mean, I know nobody actually discussed on the cost of digital public goods, but I mean, how does that? How should we be thinking about some of those maybe hidden costs as well to creating digital public goods and digital public good data as well?
Anyone like to start that question?
Well, let me begin by saying hi, Oliver. Good to see you. Okay, so what I think, I mean, you're right. I mean, maintaining databases and curating data is a costly business, and it's a hidden cost for many people. They seem to think that this stuff just propagates by itself and organizes itself by itself magically, and we know that's not the case. In the case where a government is providing, or an international organization is providing a public good, I think it's the same as providing any service. But the problem, I think the challenge has been that it hasn't been recognized as such. So people may think, you know, governments provide social welfare, which is a public good. They understand the cost. They understand that it's an exercise. Somehow a well-curated database doesn't get the same recognition. That there seems to be surprise when it's cost. So I think, and in fact, this has come up in one or two of the questions I see in the chat too. There is a kind of a more broad general communication challenge around the costs involved. And especially since things have digitized, I think it's only increased the misapprehension that with this famous data deluge, now that there's data everywhere, it seems to be the idea that somehow the cost has fallen, when in fact quite the opposite is true. The cost has gone up because now you're having to trawl through a lot more sludge to get what you want and to organize it and clean it. And I think that it's a massive communication problem to get governments to understand that data aren't free.
I'd also add, I think, I was just going to add that it's quite hard to sometimes estimate what you think the costs are going to be as well, like as a civil servant in government. And then when you're in that process of bidding for money over like a 3-year period, how are you meant to know what your data system is really going to cost you in like 2 years' time? When things might change, you might have a load more data, or things change with your suppliers. And so the way that we try and do the forecasting and giving out funding doesn't always work very well either, or support and that kind of flexibility that you need. And then I'd also add, I suppose, that a lot of the focus goes on funding the specific government department's database or that they need, and not that kind of wider infrastructure that might be needed in the wider public sector that helps with some of those like data collection and trust issues. Because as Steve was saying, like it's hard enough to kind of fight for your funding to get that in place. Then you've got all of those wider ecosystem issues that still don't get adequately funded either.
Nicola, Christina, anything to add to that?
I realize there's few answers and more questions that Oliver opened up for all of us. But I suppose with respect to thinking of variables that affect cost, and a very small problem that we're facing right now is, say, the DPI map as a project has generated a very large data set. We're supported by grant funding. How do we keep this alive? How do we think of users, who we're adding value to, and accordingly, how can we cost them or charge them? The fun thing about data is that the people who build the data set are not the users of the data directly. And the primary users thought of when you're building a data set are not all the users. So even though you might charge one sort of segment, you can't charge another. So costing becomes unsustainable. There are also different models coming to play. I think Nicholas spoke to the community-driven model, the data trust example, where if you monetize data, any user who uses the data set basically pays into a fund, and then the fund compensates the data subjects or the primaries who contributed the data in the first place. Those are models that have seemed to be successful with smaller data sets. But I think as soon as the data set is made public, when its governance model is made public also, then it should be very specific in terms of who needs to be compensated for its use. The open data movement has put a lot of data out into the public, but it's not made very plain how it can be sustainably scaled and operated, which is its own issue in some way, and it's very largely politically driven, so that's a whole beast to deal with. But I do sense that if governance models around data are made more public, then attributing those who create value and compensating them might be a more sustainable next step. But this involves a sea of change. So obviously, this is another question to contribute back to your question and not an answer.
Thanks, Christina. Great, thanks, Oliver, for that question. So we have a couple of questions about communication, as Steve mentioned. So there's one from Henry about professionals communicating that data does not speak for itself, and from Toby about people communicating data should be held accountable. Don't know, Henry, Toby, if you wanted to add anything to that question. You're happy for the speakers just to answer that. Do come on a screen, but otherwise I'll hand over to one of the speakers. So this is about, yeah, okay, so Henry's happy with that question. Any thoughts on communication, about the responsibility of professionals to communicate aspects of data?
Yes, I mean, this is the importance of a session like today. I think statistical offices are always trying their best to communicate. They're trying to communicate many things. I mean, we're trying to communicate estimates and what those estimates mean. In most cases, we're also trying to communicate the uncertainty around those estimates. And this is usually something a lot of people don't want to hear. In my case, it's often been, as soon as you start talking about precision and lack of, people shut off. They just want the number. So that's something we're always struggling to communicate with. And another challenge, which is one that Nicola mentioned earlier, I think as statisticians, we understand that in most cases, these are artificial artifacts. I mean, in a lot of cases, not just the statistic itself, but even the concept behind the statistic is a man-made artifact. You know, so if we're counting trees, it's relatively straightforward. But if you're producing an estimate for GDP or excess mortality, I mean, there's a lot of conceptual work behind that. And one of the dangers of that is by producing that estimate, you often end up inadvertently shaping the narrative and shaping the discussion, because people don't really spend a lot of time thinking about the concepts. They just use the numbers. And I think we're very conscious as producers that we're always trying to get people to engage in the conceptual piece as well, to understand the limitations of the concept, or why we picked particular thresholds, why we picked particular definitions. But it's incredibly difficult. And in fact, we have a project here. We're just starting a project using AI to try and look at the main users of our statistics who are not selling them on, but repurposing them to see, are they actually translating our statistics correctly? Because in a lot of cases, that's where misinformation comes from. It's inadvertent. They take an OECD statistics, maybe they take a World Bank statistic, and they put them together, or they use one as a denominator in a way that they shouldn't have done. So we're trying to trace those to see, are people using our statistics correctly, to try and help them. But it's an incredibly difficult job, because as one of the people in the chat noted, a lot of people don't source their statistics directly from the NSO anymore. They're taking it via a different platform, like a secondary source. And that's really difficult to try and police how people are taking our statistics and whether they're presenting them faithfully. In a lot of cases, we have a kind of a Chinese whispers scenario where each time it moves on a stage, the definition changes slightly because somebody decides to simplify or to reword it slightly. And before you know it, the statistic is quite different to the original source. So all I can say is it's something we're acutely aware of, I think, across the statistical community. It's something we work hard on to try and improve our communication, but it's very, very difficult. And let me just give you one simple example. We publish inflation statistics every month for the OECD countries, and inflation is falling at the moment. And I've seen a number of people now making the comment that, oh, inflation is falling, the battle with, households' battle with expensive goods is over. And that's completely false. So the fact that inflation is falling, that means prices are still rising, but they're rising at a slower rate. So this month, as we publish our statistics on inflation, we're publishing a blog side by side it to try and explain the difference between levels and rates of change, to help people understand that in fact the real income has actually fallen, and that's different to inflation, because this is the challenge. Sometimes these concepts are very difficult, and people who are using them don't actually understand what they're talking about. In the case of inflation, I'm talking about actually economists who you would expect to know better, but in fact don't.
Thanks, Steve. Nicola, Christina, anything to add to that? We can move on to the next question if you like. So yeah, we got one question, I think, for Nicola to try and squeeze in. And then there's a question for Simon as well, which we will try and deal with offline. So Simon, I hope we can contact you, try and get some answers from the speakers to you separately. So the question from Christine. Christine, welcome to come on screen if you'd like to ask the question yourself. But it's about citizen science and kind of GDPR considerations. So I don't know, Nicola, if you've had a chance to read the questions about people with a particularly rare disease group getting together and forming a charity. How can they cope with GDPR?
Yeah, so I suppose very quickly, like I imagine in that case, it would probably rely on consent, but there's quite a few different like legal bases, and then there's like specific health data regulations that apply as well, so probably can't do it justice in about 30 seconds. But there are also like potential changes coming down the line for reuse of data for scientific research with the new data bill in the UK, so I'd probably keep an eye on that as well. GDPR, I guess, can sometimes be a challenge for research in the health space, but also is a really important safeguard. So it's just kind of finding the balance between that enables innovation but doesn't remove people's data rights. But yeah, I'd say keep an eye out on what's happening with the new legislation and how that might change things.
Thanks, Nicola. Right, we're out of time. Sorry we didn't get through all the questions today, but just want to thank the three speakers again for great talks and a great discussion. So excellent presentations. Okay, that's great. Thanks everyone for joining again, and have a good rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.